a CIA agent's unraveling of corruption. The night was quiet in Arlington, Virginia. Streetlights flickered above deserted sidewalks, their dim glow casting long shadows on empty roads. It was well past midnight, and the town lay in a hush, save for the occasional hum of a car speeding past. Talia Porter sat behind the wheel of her sleek black SUV, her hands relaxed on the steering wheel. She had spent years perfecting the art of blending in, and tonight was no different. Her posture was casual, her face unreadable, but beneath the surface, her mind was always working, calculating. Tonight was supposed to mark the end of her operation, months of gathering intelligence, slipping through the cracks unnoticed. One last quiet drive home before she disappeared from this town forever. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. As she approached an intersection, she slowed, her sharp eyes catching the reflective gleam of a stop sign ahead. She came to a full stop, her hands steady, her instincts sharp. Then, she made the turn. Moments later, the night was shattered by the sudden flash of red and blue lights in her rearview mirror. The wail of a siren cut through the stillness, a sharp and deliberate sound that sent an unspoken message. You've been chosen tonight. Talia's heart didn't race. She was trained for moments like this. Instead, her breathing deepened, her mind sharpening like a blade being drawn. She guided her SUV to the side of the road, turned off the engine, and reached for her glove compartment to retrieve her license and registration. Behind her, a police cruiser rolled to a stop, headlights casting long beams across the pavement. Two figures emerged. Officer Brandon Carter walked with an authoritative gait, his square jaw set in an expression of cool detachment. His partner, Officer Mark Sullivan, shorter and stockier, flanked him like a silent enforcer. Their uniforms, crisp and official, gleamed under the streetlights, badges catching the dim glow. Carter approached first, shining his flashlight into her window. The beam swept across her face, lingering for just a second too long, then moved over the interior. His expression didn't change, but Talia caught the flicker of something in his eyes, an assessment, a calculation. Good evening. His voice carried the practiced authority of a man who was used to being obeyed. You know why I pulled you over tonight? Talia met his gaze without hesitation, her tone calm and measured. No, officer. I wasn't speeding, and I came to a full stop at the intersection. A small, condescending smile tugged at the corners of Carter's lips. Actually, you failed to stop at that sign back there, he said smoothly. That's a moving violation. Talia's brow furrowed ever so slightly. She had seen the sign. She had stopped. Something was off. Still, she kept her expression neutral. I'm certain I stopped, officer, she said evenly. Carter's smile didn't waver. License and registration. She handed over the documents without hesitation, her movements deliberate. She wasn't in the mood for unnecessary escalation. Carter studied her license, his eyes flicking between her photo and the local address printed beneath her name. You live around here? Yes, officer. Before the conversation could continue, Sullivan's voice called from the back of her SUV. Hey, Carter, you might want to take a look at this. Carter straightened, passing her documents back without another word. His expression had shifted, colder now, more purposeful. Stay in the car. Talia watched through the side mirror as the two officers hovered at the trunk of her vehicle. Sullivan gestured towards something, his voice low and conspiratorial. Carter nodded. A silent exchange of understanding passed between them. A flicker of unease touched Talia's spine, not fear, but instinct. Carter returned, his expression now grim. Step out of the vehicle. Talia didn't move. May I ask why, officer? We've got reason to believe you're in possession of illegal substances. His voice was clipped, almost rehearsed. Talia's gaze didn't waver. Illegal substances. She repeated the words slowly, letting them settle. I think you've made a mistake. Carter's smirk widened. We'll see about that. Sullivan was already waiting at the trunk, his eyes gleaming with something close to satisfaction as he theatrically lifted the lid. And there it was. A small, unmarked bag sat near the edge of the trunk, its presence deliberate. Conspicuous. Well, what do you know? Sullivan drawled, shaking his head with mock surprise. A bag of powdery goodness. Talia's eyes flicked from the bag to the officers. She was certain it hadn't been there when she left her house. This was a setup, an elaborate one. Carter moved closer, enjoying the moment. Anything you want to tell us? Talia's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile, subtle, calculated. I'll save my comments for the appropriate setting. Carter chuckled, clearly mistaking her calm for arrogance. "Oh, you'll have your chance." Sullivan moved to cuff her, his grip rougher than necessary. Talia let him. "You're making a big mistake," she murmured, her voice carrying a quiet intensity. For just a fraction of a second, Sullivan hesitated. Then the cuffs clicked shut. "Yeah, we'll see," Carter said, leading her toward the squad car. "Let's see how confident you are in front of a judge." As they drove away, Talia gazed out the window, her mind already spinning through her options. The officers might think they had just made an easy arrest, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. The ride to the station was cloaked in silence. The only sounds were the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the police radio. Talia sat in the backseat, her hands cuffed behind her expression unreadable. Streetlights passed in rhythmic intervals, painting fleeting shadows across her face. Carter glanced at her in the rearview mirror, his lips curling into a faint smirk. "You don't seem too worried." His voice carried a thread of mockery, a deliberate attempt to provoke. Talia met his gaze through the mirror, steady and unflinching. "Should I be?" Carter chuckled, shaking his head. "You're either brave or stupid, lady. I've seen a lot of people act tough, but it never lasts long in the holding cell." Talia didn't respond. She didn't need to. She knew men like Carter, men who thought they were untouchable, men who bent the rules and walked away without consequence. For now, she let them believe they had won. But the truth had a way of surfacing. And when it did, it would explode. The calm before the storm. The illusion of control was a fragile thing. Carter believed he had the upper hand, but that wouldn't last. The police station was quiet when they arrived, the air thick with the stale scent of burnt coffee and old paperwork. The night shift officers lounged behind their desks, sipping from dented mugs and murmuring in low voices, their conversation dull and routine. The overhead fluorescent lights flickered slightly, casting a cold, artificial glow over scuffed linoleum floors and walls lined with peeling paint. Talia walked in with the same composed stride she always had, her hands cuffed in front of her. She wasn't resisting, wasn't fighting, just watching. Carter's voice rang out, brash and loud, cutting through the quiet. "Got ourselves a big one tonight." A few officers glanced up from their desks, their interest piqued, some smirking, others indifferent. Sullivan, always the performer, tossed the small bag onto the counter with a theatrical flick of his wrist. The bag landed with a soft plop against the surface, its contents shifting ever so slightly inside. "Caught her red-handed," Sullivan added, his smug grin widening. "Looks like she's been running more than just stop signs." Talia said nothing. Her gaze swept the room instead, memoizing every detail. The placement of the cameras, the layout of the desks, the way officers moved about the station with casual ease. It was a small precinct, the kind where everyone knew each other, where favors were exchanged in the form of silence and unspoken understandings. They guided her to the fingerprinting station. The young officer stationed there hesitated slightly as she approached, his tired eyes scanning her face with something close to curiosity. Unlike Carter and Sullivan, there was no arrogance in his expression, just uncertainty. He motioned for her to place her hands on the ink pad. She complied, her movements smooth, deliberate, betraying nothing. "Name?" he asked, his voice quieter than the others, almost apologetic. "Talia Porter," she answered evenly. A pause. "Occupation?" Talia hesitated for the briefest moment, considering her response. Then, with a small, knowing smile, she answered. "Consultant." The word was vague but truthful. It was enough to pass scrutiny, yet careful enough to avoid outright deception. The young officer nodded, his fingers hesitating over the keyboard before he continued typing. Carter and Sullivan, meanwhile, leaned against the counter, laughing quietly among themselves, enjoying the spectacle of it all. Talia tilted her head slightly, her voice cutting through their amusement like a blade. "So tell me, Officer Carter, how long have you been planting evidence?" Their laughter stopped. Both men turned toward her, their smugness flickering for a split second. Carter's expression darkened. "You've got a smart mouth." His voice was lower now, controlled but laced with irritation. "Let's see how funny you are after a night in lockup." They led her down the dimly lit corridor, the air turning colder as they approached the holding cells. The heavy iron door swung open, and Talia stepped inside without resistance. The walls were bare, the cot stiff, the single overhead light buzzing faintly. The cell door clanged shut behind her. Carter lingered for a moment, watching her through the bars with a mix of curiosity and disdain. "You don't look like the type to get mixed up in this kind of thing," he said almost conversationally. But don't worry, the courts love a good sob story. Maybe they'll go easy on you. Talia tilted her head, her eyes locking onto his. Or maybe they'll see through yours. The calm way she said it, so certain, so controlled, made Carter shift slightly. He muttered something under his breath before walking away. She was alone now. Talia leaned back against the cold metal wall, exhaling slowly. The night was long, but she knew better than to waste energy on worry. Instead, she did what she did best, observe. The low hum of the station's fax system buzzed through the silence. The footsteps of officers passing by her cell revealed their routines. The measured, confident steps of senior officers, the hurried shuffle of younger ones. The faint beeping of the station's computers echoed from the front desk, the occasional crackle of the police radio breaking the stillness. Every detail mattered. Time passed, slow but purposeful. In the break room, Carter and Sullivan sat back with their coffee, laughing between sips, their voices muffled by the thin walls. "She thinks she's untouchable," Sullivan scoffed, shaking his head. "Did you see her face? Not even a flicker of panic." "Yeah, well, that'll change," Carter replied, smirking. "She's just another name in the system now. Nobody's gonna dig too deep." Sullivan chuckled. "Besides, we've got everything we need. The evidence is airtight." But not everyone in the station was so sure. At the front desk, Officer James Keller sat in front of his monitor, fingers hovering uncertainly over his keyboard. Something wasn't right. The way Talia Porter had carried herself, the way she'd spoken. She wasn't like the other arrests he had processed. And then there was the bag. Perfectly placed. Too perfect. Like a stage prop waiting for its cue. Keller glanced up at the surveillance monitors, watching the live feed from the hallway outside the holding cells. Talia Porter was sitting on the bench, perfectly still, her expression unreadable. She wasn't worried. She was waiting. And Keller had the uneasy feeling that when she finally moved, when she finally made her move, everything they thought they knew was going to come crashing down. The breaking point. A pale sliver of dawn crept through the narrow, high-placed window of Talia's cell. She hadn't moved much throughout the night, remaining upright on the bench, eyes half closed, as if in meditation. Sleep was a luxury she rarely indulged in during missions. She listened instead. The station was coming to life, the murmurs of officers arriving for the day shift, the distant ringing of a phone, the faint clatter of someone stirring a spoon against the inside of a coffee mug. A loud buzz signaled the unlocking of the cell block door. Footsteps. Heavy boots. A familiar cadence. Sullivan appeared in front of her cell, a clipboard in hand, his ever-present smirk fixed in place. "Morning, sunshine," he said, his voice dripping with mock cheerfulness. "You sleep okay, or was the cot not 5-star enough for you?" Talia met his gaze, silent. And for the briefest second, his smirk faltered. He cleared his throat, shifting slightly. "You've got a bail hearing this afternoon," he said, tapping his pen against the clipboard. "But between you and me, I wouldn't get your hopes up. Judges around here don't take too kindly to drug traffickers." Talia tilted her head, her expression calm. "Good to know." The confidence in her voice unsettled him. Sullivan frowned, muttered something under his breath, and walked away. From the front desk, Keller watched the scene unfold on the monitor. His gut told him this wasn't right. His gut told him she wasn't who they thought she was. And for the first time, he wondered, had they just arrested the wrong person? Or had they walked straight into something much, much bigger? And if they had, who, exactly, was Talia Porter? The cracks began to show. The surveillance camera outside Talia's cell was old, outdated and poorly maintained, like most of the equipment in the station. The budget, she guessed, didn't prioritize state-of-the-art security. It was a detail that worked in her favor. She waited until the hallway was clear. Then, with a barely perceptible movement, she shifted slightly on the bench. Hidden in the hem of her jacket was a small, inconspicuous tracker, standard issue for CIA operatives in the field. With a simple press of her hand against the fabric, she activated it. A silent signal. A beacon. Within moments, her team would know exactly where she was. There was no need to speak, no need to explain. They would know what to do. The illusion of control. In the break room, Carter and Sullivan sat back with their coffee, laughing over the morning paper. "She's probably sitting in there thinking she's going to crack us," Carter scoffed, shaking his head. Sullivan chuckled, licking sugar from his fingers. "Yeah, well, she's in for a rude awakening. This case is a slam dunk." We've got the drugs, the arrest report, and no witnesses. Nobody's coming to save her. Carter leaned back, his grin wide and self-satisfied. You know what I love about this job? The predictability. You see the same types over and over. They think they are smarter than us, but they never are. Their laughter echoed through the station. They had no idea. At that moment, in a nearby office miles away, a nondescript phone buzzed softly. A hand reached for it, fingers steady and precise. A calm voice answered. Signal received. Location confirmed. Deploying resources. The operation was in motion. The waiting game. Talia leaned her head back against the cold concrete wall, closing her eyes for a brief moment. She could almost feel it, the quiet precision of her team mobilizing, the calculated movements unfolding behind the scenes. Every second brought her closer to the inevitable reckoning. When she opened her eyes, a faint smile tugged at her lips. Not a smile of amusement. A smile of certainty. They had no idea what was coming. Outside her cell, the station bustled with its usual morning activity. Officers filed reports, answered calls, exchanged pleasantries over cups of lukewarm coffee. Business as usual. For everyone except Talia Porter. For Carter and Sullivan, today felt like a victory lap. For Talia, it was merely the waiting game. She remained motionless in her cell, her posture as composed as ever. Through the bars, she caught glimpses of the station's activity, the occasional passing shadow, snippets of conversation. But she stayed still, unremarkable, invisible, until the exact moment when visibility would matter most. Her team wouldn't act immediately. Timing was everything. In the meantime, she had a different mission. She needed to plant the seed of doubt. A cracked foundation. At the front desk, Officer James Keller glanced at the holding cell monitor again. Talia Porter hadn't moved much since her arrival, but something about her unnerved him. She wasn't scared. She wasn't defiant. She was patient, like she was waiting for something. The realization made his stomach twist. With a frown, Keller pulled up her file. Her driver's license, address, everything was in order. But then he noticed it. An unusual gap in her employment history. Her most recent job. Independent consultant. No further details. Keller frowned, minimizing the file. He glanced toward the break room, where Carter and Sullivan were still laughing, still confident. Something about this felt too clean. Too convenient. Ignoring the nagging voice in his head, Keller clicked into the arrest report. Failure to yield at a marked intersection. Driver exhibited nervous behavior during questioning. Consent to search granted. Controlled substances found in the trunk. Keller muttered the words under his breath, his pulse ticking faster with every line he read. It followed procedure. On paper, it was airtight. But it felt scripted. Too perfect. His fingers hesitated over the keyboard. If he was wrong, if he started digging where he wasn't supposed to, his career could be over before it even began. But if he was right, he swallowed hard. And then, against his better judgment, he stood and walked toward the holding cells. The first fracture. Keller hesitated outside Talia's cell, his fingers drumming against his belt. She looked up at him, dark eyes sharp, assessing. Yes. Keller exhaled sharply. I just wanted to ask, did you really consent to the search of your car? Talia tilted her head slightly. Studying him, she saw the doubt in his eyes, the hesitation in his stance, and she knew she had him. Her voice was quiet but pointed. What do you think, Officer Keller? His throat tightened. I'm just doing my job. She smiled. That's what they are counting on. Keller stiffened. Men like Carter and Sullivan, she continued, her tone even, calm. They rely on people like you to look the other way. His face flushed. He opened his mouth, then closed it. He turned on his heel and walked away, muttering something under his breath. But Talia had seen it, the crack in his resolve, the hesitation in his step. The seed had been planted. The watchful eyes. Miles away, in the heart of Arlington, a black sedan rolled to a stop outside a nondescript building. Inside, a man in a tailored suit stepped out, his movements deliberate. 2 agents flanked him, their demeanor sharp and alert. ETA on extraction, one agent asked as they entered the building. The suited man checked his watch. His face unreadable. We proceed when she gives the signal. For now, we watch. Inside a secure operations room, monitors flickered with live feeds from the police station. One screen showed Talia, sitting perfectly still in her cell. Another displayed the front desk, where Keller was pacing, his unease growing. "Looks like the kid's starting to crack," one agent noted. The suited man's lips curved into a faint smile. "Good. We'll use it when the time comes." The first signs of panic. Back in the station, Carter took another sip of coffee, his eyes flicking toward the front desk. "You see Keller earlier?" he asked, frowning. Sullivan smirked. Kid looked like he'd seen a ghost. "Yeah, he's been acting weird." Sullivan shrugged. "Probably overthinking things. Fresh out of the academy, they always get jumpy on their first big case." Carter didn't respond. For the first time, doubt crept into his mind. He tapped his fingers against the table. "Yeah, let's just hope he doesn't start asking too many questions." Sullivan rolled his eyes. "Doesn't matter. The evidence is all there. Even if he gets nosy, there's nothing he can prove." Carter nodded. But for the first time, the certainty in his smirk was gone. The tipping point. Keller sat at his desk, staring at his monitor. The digital file on Talia Porter remained open, the words blurring as his mind churned. He felt it now. That knot in his chest. That whisper of doubt that refused to go away. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. He hesitated. And then, for the first time, he glanced toward the evidence locker. Something wasn't right, and he couldn't ignore it anymore. The beginning of the end. The break room smelled of burnt coffee and stale sugar, but Keller barely noticed. Carter and Sullivan were still laughing, their carefree attitudes grating against the unease coiling in his gut. The station felt different today, heavier, as if the walls themselves bore silent witness to something unspoken. He couldn't shake it. Talia's voice echoed in his mind. "That's what they are counting on." She had been calm, deliberate, as if she knew exactly which buttons to press. And maybe she did. But was she wrong? The search for truth. As the hours dragged on, Keller's doubt hardened into something else. Resolve. He needed answers. But he couldn't risk drawing attention to himself. He was already the rookie, already a target for teasing. If he stepped out of line, if he questioned the wrong things, he'd be isolated. So he waited. Waited until Carter and Sullivan left the room. Then, heart pounding, he slipped into the records archive. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting long shadows over rows of filing cabinets and computer terminals. The smell of old paper and dust filled the air. Keller logged into the system, his fingers trembling slightly as he searched. Carter. Sullivan. Past cases. The screen populated with files. Too many. He clicked through one. Then another. Then another. A pattern emerged. Minor traffic violations escalating into drug charges. The same phrasing in the reports. The same justification for searches. Most of the defendants were people of color. Most were convicted. Keller swallowed hard, his pulse hammering in his ears. This wasn't just one bad arrest. This was a system. A silent battle. Back in her cell, Talia Porter remained still, a picture of composure. Patience had been drilled into her. She had spent years training her mind for moments like this, when the waiting was long and the stakes were high. Through the bars, she watched Keller's shadow move past. Slower now. More deliberate. She could sense it, the war inside him. The quiet battle between duty and conscience. He was close. So close. She shifted slightly on the bench, her movement just enough to catch his attention. Keller stopped. His hand gripped the edge of the wall as if it were a lifeline. His face was tight with conflict. "Officer Keller." Her voice was soft, but commanding. A hesitation. "What?" His voice was low, almost defensive. Talia tilted her head. "You've seen something, haven't you?" A flicker of something crossed his face. Fear, doubt, maybe guilt. His throat bobbed. I can't." He stopped, his voice catching. "I'm just trying to do my job." Her gaze didn't waver. "And what is your job, exactly?" Silence. She leaned forward just slightly. "To follow orders? To look the other way when you know something's wrong?" Keller's jaw clenched. His fingers curled into a fist. "You don't understand how things work around here." Talia's voice was steady. "I understand more than you think." A pause. Then, quieter. "I know what it's like to feel trapped. To think you don't have a choice. But you do, Keller. You always have a choice." He took a shaky breath. Then turned and walked away. But her words followed him. The point of no return. At his desk, Keller stared at his screen, the list of cases flashing before him. Each name on the files made his stomach twist. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. A choice. The words pounded in his head. Finally, he took a breath, opened a secure email channel. His fingers moved fast now, fueled by something sharp and undeniable. He attached the files, then typed, "To whom it may concern. There's something wrong in this station. I don't know who else to turn to. Please help." He hovered for only a second, then hit send. His heart pounded as the message disappeared into the void. He didn't know who would receive it, or if they would even care. But it was a start, the first step towards something right. Shadows of suspicion. In the break room, Carter leaned back, his coffee cup resting on his knee. He eyed Keller from across the station. "You notice Keller acting weird today?" Sullivan shrugged. "Kid's always weird. What's he gonna do? Rat us out?" Carter smirked, but his eyes narrowed. "Still, keep an eye on him. Last thing we need is some rookie poking his nose where it doesn't belong." The arrival. Outside, a nondescript black sedan pulled into the lot. Inside, Talia's team prepared for their next move. They had intercepted Keller's email, exactly as planned. And now, they had what they needed to proceed. The team leader adjusted his tie. "Let's make this clean. No unnecessary disruptions. We expose this from the inside." Then, they stepped out of the car. Their badges gleamed under the sun. FBI. The storm breaks. Inside her cell, Talia smiled faintly. She couldn't see them from her vantage point. She didn't need to. She knew. Her team had arrived. The storm was no longer brewing. It was here. The hum of the station shifted, an awkward silence rippling through the room as the front doors swung open. The agents walked in, their movements measured, their presence undeniable. At the front desk, the sergeant tensed, his fingers twitching toward his radio. His voice was wary. "What's this about?" The lead agent, Daniel Price, didn't blink. "Federal investigation." The words cut through the station like a blade. "We need access to your records and holding cells. Immediately." A hesitation. A glance exchanged between officers. But no one could deny them. "Fine." The sergeant's voice was gruff. "Follow me." From his desk, Keller froze. His heart pounded. He knew. It was because of him. And across the room, near the break room door, Carter and Sullivan had stopped talking. Their laughter was gone. Their bodies were stiff. Their whispers had turned to hushed panic. For the first time, they looked afraid. The tipping point. In a small interrogation room, Agent Price watched as files poured onto the screen. Arrests. Evidence. Reports. The tech agent frowned. Their records are riddled with inconsistencies. Repeated arrests, identical phrasing, missing documentation. A pause. Then, her voice sharpened. "This isn't just bad policing. It's systemic." Price's jaw tightened. "Pull everything. I want every record, every report, and every piece of evidence tied to those two." The end of an era. In her cell, Talia closed her eyes briefly. She heard it now, the murmur of shifting power. The waiting was almost over. Her hands rested in her lap. The faint red marks from the cuffs didn't matter. Only one thing did. Justice was coming. The reckoning. The station air was thick with tension, a weight pressing down on every officer present. Conversations had died. The usual background hum of phone calls, clacking keyboards, and low chatter had faded into uneasy silence. Carter and Sullivan stood frozen, their casual smirks faltering as Agent Price's voice sliced through the air like a blade. "Officers Brandon Carter and Mark Sullivan," Price said, his tone crisp, unyielding. "We need to speak with you." Carter forced a smirk, stepping forward with feigned confidence. "What's this about?" His voice was too casual, too controlled. "We've got nothing to hide." Price didn't blink. "Good. Then you won't mind answering a few questions." The station held its breath as the agents flanked the two officers, escorting them toward the same interrogation room they had occupied so many times before. But this time, they weren't the ones in control. Keller watched from his desk, his heartbeat a pounding drum in his ears. He could see it, the cracks forming in Carter's facade, the tension tightening Sullivan's shoulders. The once confident duo now looked like cornered animals. The doors close. Minutes later, down the dimly lit hallway, the door to Talia's cell buzzed open. She didn't move right away. The agent standing before her was calm, professional, respectful. "Miss Porter," he said, "you're free to go." She stood smoothly, her movements deliberate. There was no rush, no urgency. She met the agent's gaze, nodding slightly before stepping into the hallway. Something felt lighter. The oppressive weight of the station was lifting. As she walked toward the front desk, she caught Keller's eyes from across the room. For a moment, neither spoke. Keller opened his mouth, hesitated, then closed it. Talia stopped, turning fully to face him. Her voice was quiet but firm, carrying an unspoken understanding. "Thank you." Keller's chest tightened. He gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles white. He didn't know what came next. But for the first time since joining the force, he felt like he had done something that mattered. The interrogation room. Inside the cramped, sterile room, Carter and Sullivan sat stiffly at the cold metal table. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the faint hum of the overhead light. Agent Price stood across from them, his hands resting atop a thick stack of documents. He was in no rush. The weight of evidence sat heavy between them. Finally, he spoke. "So," Price said, his tone even, "do you want to start with the arrest report, or should we jump straight to the planted evidence?" Sullivan flinched. His eyes flicked to Carter, a silent plea for reassurance. Carter squared his jaw, his voice hard with defiance. "We don't know what you're talking about." Price didn't flinch. Instead, he reached into his folder, pulled out a stack of printed photos, and began sliding them across the table. One by one. Security footage. Images of Carter and Sullivan holding the unmarked bag before Talia's car was even searched. Carter's jaw tightened. He forced himself to stay still. "That doesn't prove anything," he said, his voice like steel. "We were securing evidence." Price raised an eyebrow. "Really?" He leaned forward, his presence unshakable. "Because these timestamps show otherwise. And we have audio recordings." He dropped another document in front of them, courtesy of Miss Porter's hidden surveillance device. Sullivan paled. His hands gripped the edge of the table like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. You can't use that," he sputtered. "That's entrapment." Price smirked. "No, it's justice." He leaned back slightly, letting the words settle. "And it's just the tip of the iceberg." He tapped the folder. "We've pulled records from your past arrests. Dozens of cases. Identical patterns. All of them are under review." His expression darkened. "But let me make one thing very clear. You're not walking out of here today." The room felt smaller. Sullivan's shoulders sagged, his face crumbling under the weight of reality. Carter sat stone-faced, but his hands were shaking. The fallout. From his desk in the bullpen, Keller watched as the interrogation room doors slammed shut behind Carter and Sullivan. The sound of raised voices seeped through the walls. The once feared officers, untouchable for so long, were now trapped. Keller took a slow breath. His hands trembled slightly as he stood, walking toward Agent Price. His voice was quiet, but steady. "What happens now?" Price studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, his gaze softened slightly. "Now we clean house." A pause. "And you?" Price added, his tone shifting. "You did the right thing." Keller exhaled. A small, quiet wave of relief washed over him. For the first time, he felt a sense of purpose. The walk of shame. At the station's entrance, Talia watched. Carter and Sullivan were led past their colleagues in handcuffs. Their eyes were downcast, their faces grim. The arrogance was gone. The station buzzed with quiet murmurs, officers exchanging uneasy glances, the weight of the moment sinking in. No one spoke to them. No one defended them. Agent Price approached Talia, his expression neutral but respectful. "We've got everything we need," he said. "Your work here is done." Talia nodded. Her composure remained unbroken. "Good." She let a beat pass. Then, quieter, "Make sure it sticks." Price smiled faintly. "It will." Justice served. The crisp autumn air hit Talia's face as she stepped outside. The weight she had carried for weeks, for years, began to lift. The satisfaction wasn't loud. It was quiet, steady. Justice had been served. And this time, it would stick. The aftermath. Within hours, the story had spread like wildfire. Every news outlet ran it. Police corruption exposed. FBI takes down dirty cops in Arlington. Footage of Carter and Sullivan in handcuffs played on repeat. Their grim, hollow faces broadcast to millions. Talia's name was kept out of the media. Intentionally. The focus needed to be on the systemic rot, not on her. That was how change stuck. Weeks later, sitting on a quiet park bench, She sipped a steaming cup of coffee. The rustling autumn leaves whispered around her, a reminder of change. Agent Price sat beside her. "You could have handled this differently," he said. Talia smirked, taking a sip of coffee, and missed the look on their faces. Price chuckled. "You've got a knack for making things memorable." They sat in companionable silence, the weight of their work momentarily forgotten. The storm had passed, but its impact, that would ripple on. The price of justice. The interrogation room was suffocatingly quiet. Carter and Sullivan sat stone-faced, their once unshakable confidence crumbling under the weight of undeniable evidence. "What do we do?" The words came from Sullivan, his voice barely above a whisper. For the first time, Carter had no answer. He sat in silence, his jaw clenched, his mind racing for a way out. Finally, he spoke. "We fight it." But the words lacked conviction. And everyone in that room, including Carter himself, knew it. Their lawyers weren't optimistic. The mountain of evidence was insurmountable. And worse, the public had already made its judgment. Their faces had been plastered across every news outlet, their names synonymous with corruption and betrayal. A plea bargain was their only chance of avoiding decades in prison. And deep down, they knew it. The fallout. Back at the Arlington Police Department, the storm had only just begun. Internal investigations swept through the ranks like a wildfire, exposing even more officers with similar dirty tactics. Resignations poured in, as higher-ups scrambled to distance themselves from the scandal. The chief of police stood before flashing cameras, his face tight with carefully rehearsed regret. "We are committed to transparency and reform," he promised. But the damage was already done. The department's reputation was in shambles. The public's trust? Shattered. And at the center of it all stood Keller. He had become an unexpected symbol, both praised and ostracized. Some officers avoided him, their loyalty to the old guard unwavering. Others, they offered quiet words of support. But Keller didn't care. He had done what was right. And that was enough. A quiet conversation. A week after her release, Talia Porter sat in a small diner on the outskirts of town. The air was peaceful, the soft hum of conversation a stark contrast to the chaos she had just endured. Across from her, Keller fidgeted with his coffee cup, his expression uncertain. "I wasn't sure you'd show up," he admitted, his voice low. Talia raised an eyebrow, a faint smirk tugging at her lips. "You earned this conversation." A pause. "Not many people would have done what you did." Keller looked down at the table, conflicted. I couldn't keep looking the other way," he muttered. But then his shoulders sagged. "But honestly, I don't know if it made a difference. The department's still a mess. And people like Carter and Sullivan? There are more of them out there." Talia's gaze was steady. "It made a difference to the people they hurt," she said firmly. "And it made a difference to you." She leaned in slightly, her voice softer now. "Don't underestimate that." Keller exhaled slowly. For the first time in days, he allowed himself a small smile. "What about you?" he asked. "What happens now?" Talia leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. "Now," she smirked, "I move on to the next mission." A beat of silence. There's always another fight. The verdict. Months later, the courtroom was packed, the air thick with anticipation. Carter and Sullivan stood before the judge, their fates sealed. "How do you plead?" The words hung heavy in the air. For a moment, Carter hesitated, his jaw clenched. But there was no escape. "Guilty." His voice was barely above a whisper. Sullivan followed, his shoulders slumped in defeat. The gavel struck. Their careers were over. Their reputations? Destroyed. And for the first time, they faced the true weight of their actions. The cases they had built on lies were overturned. Innocent people were exonerated. And the community, angry, but now emboldened, rallied for deeper reforms. The scandal was no longer just a scandal. It was a catalyst for change. The next fight. In a quiet apartment, Talia packed a small bag. The room was minimalistic, barely lived in. A dossier lay open on the table, filled with details of her next assignment. Her next fight. She glanced at it briefly before closing it. Her mind was already on the road ahead. Then, her phone buzzed. She picked it up. Agent Price's voice came through the line. "Ready for the next one?" Talia smiled faintly. "Always." She grabbed her bag and stepped into the crisp evening air. The door clicked shut behind her. The fight wasn't over. Not for her. Not for the people she fought to protect. But for now, She allowed herself a small moment of satisfaction. Justice had been served. And that was enough. The truth always wins. In the end, the truth came to light. The corrupt officers who thought they were untouchable faced the consequences of their crimes. And the woman they tried to frame, she walked away victorious, stronger than ever. Because no matter how deep the lies run, the truth will always find a way to shine through.